Welcome back to Solving Basketball. If you're a college basketball fan, you know today's guest well. He's worked for Fox, CBS, ESPN, and now is a basketball analyst for Stadium, Jeff Goodman. Hey, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me on, Jordan. It's my pleasure. And this is one of those podcasts, like, I think I'm nervous going into this one just because, again, we talked about it before I came on here. Like, it's me going into your world, which is not completely foreign to me with analytics, but certainly not my forte, right? Not up my alley, if you're going to say anything. It's something that I'm trying to learn more about every year and get more comfortable with certain analytics and how to utilize them. But, yeah, that's definitely not kind of the way I've been brought up. I'm a news guy. I've watched games, and now I'm trying to, again, incorporate as much as I can analytics to try to make myself as good as I can at my job.
For sure. And if there's one thing I learned from my 3 years in college basketball, it's how to read a room of coaches to kind of get their aptitude for analytics and then know how to attack it from there. And it takes longer than others with some coaches. Some assistants are glued into KenPom and really ready to whatever I have to offer for their scout or whatever to look into it. And then others, it was like a year-long process to get them committed. I think there's a lot of similarities between media people that are also trying to use analytics in that regard.
Yep, no doubt. I think there's some of us that are way ahead of others. And, again, it's I think so many people are kind of hell-bent on KenPom, and we draw back to that because it's maybe the one that everybody just thinks is the most accurate or whatnot. And I've learned that there's certainly a lot more than just KenPom to be able to rely on it. The hard part is time for me as much as anything. The time to learn and then the time to actually utilize it while the season's going on. And there's so many other things going on. Like, I mean, even looking at teams that I want to look at, I'll write down maybe 5 teams that I want to look at numbers, each day, and I just don't get to it every week just because something else comes up.
So the first question of the podcast for every guest is if we walked into a gym right now, I went under the basket, you went to the foul line and shot 100 free throws in a row, how many would you make out of 100?
I'm like a point forward, Jordan. So like I'm free throw, I'm like 60%. Like it's not pretty. But I will tell you what, like if you tell me I'm gonna set something up, I'm gonna put something where you got a chest pass, you got to hit that target every single time, or even with one hand hit that target. Like I can hit it like 98 times out of 100. But I was never a shooter. I was more of like I said, a point forward, a passer, got that court vision. But I'm going to need it when I play Jeff Borzello. I got to play him in one-on-one at the Final Four. And he thinks I'm going to get out of this. Like, I'm like 15 years older. I just came off a major knee injury. But what I have over him is I'm like 6'2", 6'3". He's like 5. I don't know. He probably says he's 5'9". He's probably closer to 5'7". So all I'm going to do is back his ass down every play, like every time. He's never going to get the ball because even if I back him down and miss it, I'm just going to get the rebound and keep putting it back in.
What is basketball? What is this basketball? Is that basketball? What is basketball?
So I think that conversation on Twitter came from my podcast with Rob Doster, and this is Doster's quote: "Jeff Goodman is so bad, he won't show up to the media pickup game." That was his quote from his Solving Basketball appearance. And he was equally harsh on Borzello. So thoughts on Doster?
But my retort, that's complete BS. Like, I actually work and drink at the Final Four. So it's a combination of they play early in the morning. They try to play like 9:30 in the morning. And, I give them credit. Like, they're younger than me. They can bounce back quicker. When I drink hard, which I tend to do, I'll have fun and I work at the Final Four, that combination, I will tend to sleep in. And part of it is Borzello doesn't have a kid. Doster now has one, and I think one on the way. But yeah, my take is I would love to be able to play hoop every week and be in shape like that. I don't have the time. So playing a pickup game like that, I could go like a game or two, and then I'd be gassed. I'd be done. So I can't go like as long as they can. No way.
Well, I will say there needs to be statistics at this Final Four pickup game for sure. Hoop Vision will sponsor it. There definitely needs to be statistics.
Yeah, if we get I need somebody else like closer to my age who's not that like good but not great, or like throw Gary Parrish on me. I can post him up. That'll be easy. He's like Borzello's height. Actually, Parrish and Borzello should have to probably check each other. They're similar heights. I've heard Norlander's pretty good, which I still don't believe, but people have said Norlander's pretty good.
So another person on Twitter who you have had some fun with over the years is Ken Pomeroy, and that's going to lead us into some analytics talk. Clearly was always just a fun battle, I guess, between the two.
Yeah, love him.
When did you first become aware of his work and kind of like the movement?
I'd say probably had to be going back now, like 6-7 years ago. And at first I was like, all right, I can look at the rankings, but I don't really know what the hell any of this stuff means. I didn't. And you look at the rankings, and especially early on in the season, I'd look at them and be like, this is complete garbage. Same thing with the RPI. Like we all, and I was at fault of this early because you make too much out of the first couple weeks or the first month of the season. It's just you're not going to have any rating system that is going to be even close to accurate early on in the year. I remember one year, I think it was the RPI, Oregon State was like number one after the first like 5 games, and they had beaten like nobody. And I was just like, this is complete garbage. Why, I'm crushing it. And then you realize as the season goes along, like they usually take care of themselves to some extent. You can't make a determination over the first 2 weeks or month of the season, which is why I felt kind of bad when NCAA put out the net rankings. Everybody crushed them. I crushed them a little bit, but not really. I just kind of made fun of it a little bit and said, like, okay, Ohio State is the number 1 team in the country. I picked up the phone and called Chris Holtman right away. He didn't even know yet. And I said, you're number 1. And he said, what do you mean? I said, no, you're number 1 in the net. Like, this is a huge thing. And I was kind of being facetious, but and he just kind of laughed. He's like, yeah, we're not number 1. I know we're not number 1. And now it's even, more clear that, obviously they weren't number 1. They've fallen off. Sometimes you can just tell with the eye test when a number is wrong. And that's where I try to balance it the best I can. And I know I'm getting off on a tangent here from when did you first see Ken Pom and hear about him and whatnot. But I think, that's always the hard part for me when like a number I don't agree with because I've seen these kids. Like, I'll give you a good example. I'm at the Celtics game 3 weeks ago, and I'm watching the Celtics play the Toronto Raptors. And Toronto Raptors are the best team right now in the East. And I'm looking at these players, and I'm saying, like, Fred VanVleet, like a bunch of role guys other than Kawhi Leonard and Kyle Lowry. And I'm saying to myself, like, I've seen all these kids forever. Like, I can't buy into the fact that they're the best team in the Eastern Conference, even though the numbers, and the biggest number being win-loss, says they're the best team in the East right now. And that's where, again, sometimes I fight with myself to try to figure out, like, okay, this number does not make sense to me. You can try to convince me all you want. Even right now, I'm looking at Ken Pom, that Ohio State is the 16th best team in the country. Xavier. No, I'm sorry. I'm looking at 18 right now. My bad. So let's let me pick something out for the hell of it here that I would have an argument with. Well, NC State was the one that I really had a problem with for a while on both net and Ken Pom.
Yep.
Ken Pom's got NC State at 32. I don't know what they are at the net right now. They're probably around there, 30.
Yeah, right around there.
Yeah, I just think that it's off. Like I don't buy that one with the garbage that they've played. 8 games they've played complete. Teams in the 280 to 350 range. I don't know how they can be ranked 32 in the country, but again, the numbers say they are. So
let's dive into that a little bit, because NC State definitely was on my list of things. Not necessarily them specifically, but them as an example to talk about. The thing that maybe gets lost in we'll just keep saying KenPom, even though, like you said, there are plenty of other systems out there, is what Ken or anyone is trying to do is look at every team for his site. It goes back to 2002, how they performed in the past to predict how they performed in the future. So there's no like inherent bias towards a team like NC State blowing out teams. The fact of the matter is that teams in the past that have blown out really bad teams have done well. So one year, I have a good example of this. One year is Louisville, the year after they won the NCAA tournament. So it was Russ Smith's senior year. They started out the season playing College of Charleston, Hofstra, Cornell, Hartford, and Fairfield. So all the best team out of those that year was College of Charleston, ranked 200.
Okay.
And they won all 5 of those games easily. Their 6th game, they played North Carolina on a neutral, and they lost by 9. So the question becomes, should we predict their future based on just the one game, because North Carolina is the type of team that they're going to play in the NCAA tournament and play in March? Or how much value is there in those first 5 blowouts? And then to make matters worse, I guess, for Louisville, they won 6 games in a row after the North Carolina game against pretty bad teams, and then they lost to Kentucky. So it was 13 games in the season. The 2 games against pretty good teams they lost, and then all the games against bad teams they won really easily. So at the time, what I did was I went back and I looked at those 11 games and said, has anyone ever beaten bad teams this badly and not been a good team at the end of the season?
Okay.
And believe it or not, the answer was pretty much no. They're even and NC State is on the fringe of 30, whatever they are, 30-ish. That's not necessarily like a Final Four contender.
Right.
But
they were like 16
Sure.
at one point, probably 2 weeks ago.
And yeah, you're right.
They've fallen.
You're right. Exactly. And so maybe that is indicative of that early. And NC State is extreme because even compared to Louisville, their schedule was even worse. So NC State had brutal. Right. Yeah, it was insane how bad their schedule was. And I totally agree with you there. Even Ken in his system, when you play those, like a UNC Asheville this year, who's 351, those don't count as much. He weights them less. But to a certain extent, if you take 12 games out of the picture, we're missing something about that team. And that's a good data analyst, which obviously Ken is better than anyone at his job.
We don't need to blow up his head here. We don't need to blow up his ego at all. That's the last thing we want to do on this podcast. Give Kenny more fodder to think he's the greatest, statistician or analytics guy of all time in college basketball. Come on.
Well, that's actually another question that I have for you is, I think assistant coaches have been using this stuff for a long time. Was Brad Stevens the shift in head coaches?
My God. Yeah, he was so far ahead of his time. So I asked him, how about this? So 2 weeks, I think it might have been that Toronto game 3 weeks ago. So they have like a media scrum before every game where Brad talks right outside the locker room, and then the visiting team coach talks too. And I said, we recorded a podcast, myself and this young guy, Chris Grenham, who helps do the podcast with me and sometimes co-hosts. So we were talking about it, and I said on the podcast, I'm like, yeah, we got to go. We had an interview, we got to go over and talk to Brad Stevens or listen to him. I said, I'm going to ask him about the net rankings for the hell of it. and I'm thinking to myself, there's no way I'm going to ask him about the net rankings. But then I thought about it. I'm like, it could be kind of funny to see like how Brad responds. Everybody else is going to ask him questions about the Toronto Raptors. And this was like the biggest game of the regular season because they had been on a losing streak. And I'm going to just come in there at the end of it. I'm not going to be a dick and go in the middle or the beginning and ask a question that's not really relevant. I'm going to let everybody else ask their questions. And then at the end, I'm going to deadpan and just say, hey, Brad, what do you think of the net? And that's what I did. And he like paused and like you could tell the wheels were spinning. And he's like, the net? And he's like, oh, you mean the new metric by, college basketball, the NCAA. And he like answered the question like real. He's like, well, a lot of coaches, I had it in my podcast. We put it in there. He's like, a lot of coaches this time of year trying to figure it out and all this. And I looked at him like, Brad, I was just kidding. I was just having a little fun. But yeah, Brad was like the first, and again, one of the first ones. There are probably others at that level that were utilizing it at that point, but obviously he had the success. So everybody wanted to know what was it that's able to show the success that Brad Stevens was having at Butler. Because again, like when you look at it, when you go back and look at it, it's going to be one of the greatest achievements in college basketball history. Going to the NCAA, the final game, the championship game, 2 years in a row at Butler. Just insane. So I think everybody was just digging in to find out, like, what's his secret sauce, right? Like, what does Brad Stevens do differently than everybody else? And, obviously he can coach, he can develop guys, he connects with kids very well, gets them to play hard, runs great sideline out of bounds, whatever it is, all that. And then the other part was obviously the analytics part of it, the aspect that other people really weren't talking about. And you have so many old school coaches, right? I mean, a lot of the best coaches in college basketball are the old school guys at this point. The Kays, the Roys, the Izzos, the Selfs, the Boeheims. Those guys aren't doing it. So Brad was kind of one of those first ones that had been at a high level, even like Jay Wright and Billy Donovan, right? They were a little bit older and really weren't using it. But Brad was kind of one of those first ones. And I think when people saw how much he did rely on it, I think then a lot of other coaches were like, all right, like this is a pretty bright guy. If he's using it, maybe we should be looking at it too.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And you've seen it with Villanova's success, not necessarily having anything to do with analytics, but people just copying even their offense, their spread out offense, and shooting threes, which is somewhat tied into analytics. The Warriors and Villanova, it trickles down to other coaches being willing to do more, I guess.
Yeah, and I had Jay Wright on my pod last week, and usually I go about 30, 40 minutes, and I want to make it a fun podcast. And one of the questions I have written down that I didn't get to, and people probably asked him this before, I haven't heard him answer it, but he was ahead of the Warriors. Like he was. He had Randy Foy playing the four-man spot. 6'2" Randy Foy was playing the four. Now, part of it was due to injuries, but again, he was playing small ball before the Warriors were playing small ball.
No doubt. Yeah, I actually went to Villanova. I'm not sure if you know that.
I didn't.
And even when I was there, and it was during their little. You talked about it on your podcast. I listened to that one. It was during when he was on the hot seat. Was like my first year or so there. But even then, the motto was shoot 'em up and sleep in the streets. Like he was very progressive in, as long as you're taking the right shot, we don't care too much about the results on that given shot, as long as the process is right, which is now like everyone in college and in basketball in general is about that motto.
Yeah, it's gone down. I mean, I'm watching high school games. I live in Newburyport, Mass, and I know a lot of the kids and the coach on the team, and I'll go watch the high school games, and it's trickled down. I mean, even, again, kids that can't shoot threes still shoot threes. Everybody wants to be a three-point shooter, and, it's funny. I asked KD this earlier this season. I said, like, do you realize how much you changed the game? And he said, it was really Dirk. I think Dirk started it with the big shooting the threes, and now every big wants to shoot the three. But I think KD made it even, way more cool that every big guy thinks they're a three-point shooter now. Well, most big guys at least. I mean, there's still some that do some work down in the post, but there aren't many Ethan Happs anymore.
So let's stick with that Jay Wright podcast. Like you said, it was silly, talking about your kids and parenting advice, but then also you asked him about Javon Quinterly and a potential NBA job if you would be interested in that. So as someone who has interviewed some coaches on a podcast, I'm curious about the process to doing that. Do you give them a heads up on something like that?
No, nothing. No, but I take the opposite approach of a pod of some people, and mine is going to be a mixture of information and entertainment. I think you tell, like, I like to have fun. I like to mess around, and I'll say some things that are probably pretty stupid. I'll tweet plenty of things. I did earlier today. I took a screenshot of what the weather was like in Minneapolis and tweeted out and said, I can't wait to go there for the Final Four. And everybody's like, well, don't you realize the Final Four is not tomorrow. It's not today. And I'm like, no, I get it, but I don't want to go somewhere that damn cold for a Final Four. I want to go to like San Antonio. I don't want to bring a heavy coat to the Final Four. It may sound like I'm complaining. I'm not complaining. I love my job. I love my job more than anybody, but I don't want it to be in Boston, except for the fact that I could sleep in my own bed, which would be nice. But I guess it's all self-serving for me. I'd rather be in warm weather because I live in cold weather throughout the entire winter. I don't want to go to Minneapolis. So anyway, I like to have fun. I feel like in these podcasts, to me, you want to set the tone right away with the fact that this is not going to be a super serious podcast the whole way. We're going to tell stories, but we're going to get information too. And I started out with parenting. Just the way I know Jay's got a daughter who's in college. I got a daughter who's a freshman in high school. I was like, Jay, give me your best piece of parenting advice for me because I need it. And it was really good. Like, he gave me some great advice. He was like, when they're younger, we talk to them. Now, just listen. And it was a great piece of advice. Like, it was actually the one thing I'll always remember from that podcast was Jay Wright's advice on parenting. But the other thing I'll remember is him talking legitimately, and I hadn't heard him say it. You're a Villanova guy. Had you heard him talk like that about Javon Quinterly before?
I don't think so.
I mean, I don't know. I thought it was awesome to me how honest he was about the fact that the jelly ball, whatever the hell they call it, that these kids kind of grew up playing, which is like street ball. He called him a street ball player. He called Javon Quinterly a street ball player and basically was saying, I have to reprogram him. He's a good kid. He means well. It's just going to take time for him to understand how to play the game the way I want him to play the game. That's it. Like, I thought it was cool that he was able to go that way. And, a lot of it is relationships. You got to have the right relationship with the coach to be able to go that way. I'm not bringing just any coach on the podcast. The only coaches I've had on so far are the Hurley brothers together, because I know they're sarcastic as hell and they'd be entertaining and fun and tell stories and everything. And Jay Wright, I think those are the only ones I've had. I'm not bringing on just any coach, like just because of the name. I'm not going to bring on Coach K or Roy Williams just because of their name. I'm going to bring them on because I think they can entertain and inform, and they're not going to just give me these basic vanilla answers. That's why I brought on Jay. And honestly, he was phenomenal.
For this podcast, I've had 3 head coaches, Chris Jans and Eric Musselman, who were my bosses, and then also Kyle Smith from San Francisco. And it's always a fine line. Mostly we talk about analytics and X's and O's both, and it's a fine line between asking the questions that I want to ask, but also asking ones that they can legitimately answer. Especially X's and O's wise, which is similar to any podcast with a coach, but X's and O's wise, there's some stuff that they want to keep to themselves for sure. So this reminds me of a tweet that you had, I think it was yesterday, that in this day and age, it's tough to be a critical beat writer. And I mean, this all kind of ties into each other a little bit. So why specifically now is it, as opposed to, I guess, when you were starting out as a reporter?
Well, it's changed. I mean, the whole industry's changed so much now that people are more thin-skinned. I think fewer people are doing actual reporting than were doing it 5 years ago. I think now it's easy to just kind of have a hot take and throw it out there and watch a game and not actually report. Like I do a column, and I haven't done it every week, but I try to do it every week, where it's like an old Boston Globe column, like Bob Ryan or Peter Gammons or Will McDonough, what I grew up reading, which is you make a ton of phone calls, and you try to get what you can. You try to see what you can get, something different. And it's like different topics. You'll have like a 500-word lead and then a bunch of other subheads underneath it, and then a bunch of just notes at the bottom. So I love doing that. But I think the hardest part these days, and not only for beat writers, but for everybody, is again, in order to get information, people think they have to sell out and not be honest. And that's not the case. Like, you can still, and if somebody won't give you information because you're not kissing their ass, who the hell cares? Like, there's a lot of other coaches. Now, again, it's easy for me to say because I'm a national guy, right? But beat writers, you can't be on the outs necessarily, or it's hard to do that if you're covering a specific coach. And that's what I was trying to tell Zach, who covers St. John's, give him credit, because he won't be rah, rah, rah. There's just too many other beat writers around the country that just kiss the ass of whatever coach or whatever program or whatever sport, whatever it is that they're covering, because they want information, they want access. I understand it. It's hard to do your job without access. Listen, I don't have any relationship with John Calipari. I haven't had any relationship with John Calipari for more than a decade now. More than a decade. And you could say arguably he's probably run college basketball as much as anybody else in the country. It hasn't hurt me. Like, it hasn't hurt me. I mean, yeah, access-wise, I don't get the same access, but I'm not writing the same kiss-ass stories about Kentucky that everybody else is writing. I'm writing both sides of the coin, and I'm going to try to do that with everybody. You know, I always say this, like Paul Hewitt, former Georgia Tech, former George Mason coach, was probably one of the coaches I was closest with and still am to this day. He's now a scout with the Clippers. I put him in the hot seat twice when he was at Georgia Tech. He understood it. He got it. He wasn't happy about it, but he got it. I put Mark Fox on there, another guy that who's out of work right now. You know, having to break the story when Mark Fox was fired, yeah, it sucked, but it's my job. You got to do it. You got to wake up every day saying, like, all right, you know what? I'm going to be as honest as I can be. Now, am I human too? Sure, of course I'm human. But again, I find it really hard to watch these people now that get news, get information at the expense of just putting out whatever somebody wants them to put out, whether it's a coach, an agent, something like that. I just feel like you got to be honest to yourself. Try to be true to yourself. I know journalism has changed significantly. I grew up being taught at the Associated Press. You know, so I think it was a little bit different for me. I grew up in Boston and not a fan of any team. I'm not a fan of the Celtics. Didn't grow up as a fan of the Celtics. Didn't grow up as a fan of the Patriots or the Red Sox or any of them. I knew this is what I wanted to do at a pretty young age. So while I have affinities to certain players because I know them, I don't have affinities to any programs. I'm an Arizona grad. They hate me in Tucson. Hate me. Because I'll say it the way it is. I'll try to, at least. Maybe I'm wrong, but at least I'm going to give you what I think is my unfiltered opinion that is not based on me taking money from a shoe company or me taking money from a program to speak for, you know, at that program or anything like that. I think I'm going to, you know, again, I think I'm going to be objective, or as objective as you can be, which nobody can be completely objective when you're doing a job like this, because again, there are relationships. So it's hard to do that. But I think I try to be as objective as I can be.
And I think another thing adding to all this is, like, I've noticed with Duke, they give Zion and RJ like a phone or a camera in the locker room and have them basically cover themselves. A lot of social media stuff that schools are doing where the line between like reporting and just PR is a little bit blurred. What this is putting you on the spot a little bit, but
Don't ever worry about putting me in the spot. Don't ever worry about putting me in the spot. I'm good.
if you were coming up like as a college kid who had the goals that you had, what would your advice be for like because anyone can start a Twitter account now and get pretty good reach. I mean, maybe not right away, but there's definitely are examples of it. So what would your advice be for almost like a mission or a slant for that person to cover college basketball?
You mean if I were a player these days?
No,
or
someone with your ambitions, but younger.
Coming up,
trying to do something like you did.
Yep. I mean, it's working your ass off. Number one, like I hate to say it, but it's true. I mean, again, I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I see her work ethic or lack thereof at times, and I have nephews and nieces, and they're all in their 20s. So I get it. I would say work ethic can really set you apart more now than ever. And networking. Like those are the two, come up with something unique, come up with something different. There are plenty of projects that I can't even get to right now that I would love to be able to track. And I'm going to do it at some point, like, grad transfers and like how many were successful transferring up, transferring down. What are the numbers? I want to get to it. I'm one person and I just haven't been able to do it. But like, I think these days, because anybody can get their brand out there or get their information out there, if you do something really good that's worthwhile, I mean, look at you and like how you've been able to, you've crushed it this year to me, in my opinion, with some of the things that you've done, right? Some of the information that you've been able to put out that's really unique and really easy to comprehend, like easy for idiots like myself, which is not that easy to do. But seriously, I mean that, Jordan. Like what you've done to me is so unique. And there's a young kid that works at Stadium who just got hired recently, named Andy Wittry, who was talking about that. I was with him at the Northwestern game last week, and he was saying like he wanted to do kind of some of the things you're doing. And I said, like, that's a great way to do it right now, is like, but you got to come up with something that's your own. And you did that, and people take notice because you're working hard. It's unique, it's creative, it's accurate, it's informative, and it's entertaining in a way again, because it's relevant information. So I think that's part of it is, again, you got to work hard. You got to meet the right people. You have the ability now that I didn't really have. Like my first interview was with James Worthy when I was 13 years old in Boston when the Lakers were playing the Celtics. And I just went down to the hotel and asked him if I could do an interview with him, called him up later that day and had like 20 dumb questions for him. And I didn't do anything with it because I didn't have anywhere to put it. I was 13. I think I lied to him and said I was in high school. And it was for the high school newspaper, but it wasn't. I had nowhere to put it. These days, there's so many avenues to be able to get information out there. And I think that's a huge advantage of kind of the generation coming up.
Yeah, well, first of all, I really appreciate that. I mean, thank you so much for saying that. But the thing that I'll echo is the hard work part. So one thing that 3 years as a college basketball video coordinator helps you do is learn how to work hard. I mean, those are
under Musselman, of course it did, right? And Jans,
all three of them.
Who was the third? Jans, Musselman, and who?
Paul Weir.
Oh, Paul Weir. So do you dress like Paul Weir, or who do you dress most like out of those three?
Probably Muss with like the polo. Muss is all polo now.
Wait, can we? Are we allowed to ask questions in this podcast? Am I allowed to ask you your best Eric Musselman story, or no? Or can we not go there?
No. I mean, I said putting you on the spot earlier, so I guess you got to do it too.
He's mellowed out, like on the sideline. I got to say, I've seen them play 3 times this year already, and he's mellowed out. And I don't know if part of that was like I think a year ago, I think Jordan Bejant, Danny Hurley's agent, probably told him, "Hey, you want to mellow out a little bit if you want to get." A job like UConn. I wonder if the same thing, I think Muss has Jordan Bejant too. I wonder if the same thing happened there because Muss, or it's just he's got an older team and he trusts them. because he really does. He lets them play with the Martin twins and Jordan Carolina. He really lets them go. Anyway, I didn't mean to take that from you.
No doubt. All right, I'll give you one story because
Give me a good one.
yeah, I think you said it on the Hurley podcast. I think I'm not sure, but you said it on a podcast that a coach, or maybe it was Jay Wright about Quinterly. A coach, they just want to win. Like there's no like conspiracy theory going on in terms of why someone's not playing. Like their intentions are to win, and so I agree with you. But I have a Muss example of this. But this is I think universal. Is I remember it was Muss's first year when I worked for him, and after a game one time he admitted that like APR. And having a kid potentially transfer was in his mind during a game as to play a kid or not. So like,
wow.
Let's put it this way: coaches are doing what's best for the program. And there's no conspiracy theory that they wouldn't do what's best for the program. But that's the crazy part about being a college coach as opposed to an NBA where it's just basketball all the time is there are a million different things going on behind the scenes, I guess.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, listen, you hear it all the time now where mid-major guys don't want their kids taking summer school, a lot of them, because they're going to graduate potentially and have a year left. And they can be a grad transfer. So, I mean, that's another example of just, how they're making decisions that are based more on the program than necessarily on the kid, right? I mean, obviously, if you're doing it for the kid, you want the kid to graduate as quickly as possible. Maybe you can go to grad school even. But a lot of these guys now are worried, and rightfully so, that they're going to lose their best player to grad transfer and thus end up losing their job. Look at Gary Waters at Cleveland State. The guys that he had there a few years ago, if he had kept them all, he might have gotten an extension instead of getting fired.
Yeah. And the reason why kids started graduating so much is that the NCAA allowed practices in the summer. So now everyone was trying to get their players into summer school and get them more classes. And then it had the effect on the back end. So like whatever the NCAA incentivizes is what's going to be exploited. That's kind of a cynical term, but by coaches, and it can have unforeseen consequences, which is probably what happened with the whole like Condoleezza Rice committee too. Is that there's just a lot going on that they don't really understand.
Well, they got the wrong people on that committee. Let's face it. The number one thing was they just had the wrong people on that commission, which doesn't surprise me. But again, my take is if you had the right people on that commission, at least it would have stood a chance. And the right people, not crushing the Condoleezza Rices and the Grant Hills and the David Robinson, the JT3s and the Mike Montgomerys, like who all I think have the best interests of the game at heart. They just don't know. They don't know what goes on in terms of cheating. A lot of them don't know what goes on anymore in terms of, around summer basketball and that recruiting calendar. So I just think they made some poor decisions with who was on the commission, thus then creating some poor decisions on how to implement change.
So the last thing here, I'm going to go back to the analytics. There's one thing on my list that we didn't talk about, and overall, I just don't think that there was enough banter back in analytics banter in this podcast. So let's try to.
There wasn't. We got to do it again. Yeah, we can do it again. I want to come on for one podcast where you just literally teach for the entire podcast. It's like a lesson. It's like analytics 101.
I am totally down for that. Whatever you want. But okay, here's the last thing. On the flip side of the North Carolina State, the beating bad teams by a lot. Another way that your KenPom rank can get out of whack with what the AP Top 25 might say, or just perception, is if you win a lot of close games, you won't look that great in the KenPom formula, generally speaking. So my question for you is, if a game is tied with a minute left, how much do you think that minute should determine what you think of the team? I think that is a big part of where analytics versus the eye test can like separate.
No, I think huge. I think in the last minute of a tie game is huge for me because that's pressure. Yeah, I mean, definitely a lot more than when NC State's already up 25 points against, whatever, sister of the poor, and beating the crap out of her and, running it up to run the efficiency numbers up. Like that, I didn't even know it. And I don't know, did you know it right away? When that came out and they said, all right, the scoring margin's capped at 10.
Yep.
I thought, all right, that's good. I didn't understand that the efficiency numbers could be, I guess I just didn't think of it. Like, obviously it makes sense now, but I didn't understand that that's what could happen here is teams could run up their efficiency numbers so high against bad teams or subpar teams to be able to kind of not take advantage of the net rating, but certainly help their net rating. I didn't get that.
Right. So when they put out a little like flyer explaining the components, and I think that day I had a head coach ask me, so should we run up the score or not? And it was a smart head coach who realized that the efficiency thing might be the case. And from then on, I told him, I think you should. We need to have a little bit more information about it. And then when they released the first ratings, the one where Ohio State was number one, that's where I had a tweet ready to go, kind of comparing it to efficiency. And at that point, it was pretty clear that it wasn't capped. And then David Warlock on KenPom's podcast confirmed that.
Do you think they'll change it, Jordan?
I do.
Do you think they'll change it before next year?
I do, actually.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, just based off of the NCAA's like dialogue about it and all these coaches speaking out. I know you had something about Nate Oates, I think, and I've seen Will Wade also talk about it. I do think that they'll change something. Here's what I would say, though, is, and I've said this on a few of these podcasts, so listeners are kind of familiar with the argument, is the problem with the net is that it doesn't have a designated purpose. Like, we don't know if you're trying to evaluate the best resumes, then the difference between winning a game by one and losing a game by one is humongous. Like that's what basketball is. That's what sports are.
Of course. Yes.
If you're trying to predict who's going to win in the future, that's a different argument. And the net is probably pretty good at that because of how it uses efficiency. But that's not how we would want to pick teams to make the NCAA tournament. My whole thing has been that the NCAA just needs to be clear about the intentions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, listen, I mean, don't you, when you asked that question a couple minutes ago about, how important it is tie game in the last minute, like that's as important as anything. Like you can't say that has the same value to it as the first 2 minutes of the game.
Right. From a resume perspective, no doubt.
Right. I mean, it determines who wins the game and who doesn't. Like, I get, like when you talk about referees and you have to make the same call the first 2 minutes of the game as the last two minutes of the game. I understand all that. But at the end of the game, like that's what, again, determines whether you're going to win. To me, again, I don't know. I just feel like the core numbers still are wins, losses, who you're beating, where you're beating them. Those are like the most important things. Are they not?
Yes. And I guess for this hypothetical next podcast that you were talking about, what we can do is talk about rating systems that do that. So that's not what KenPom is trying to do, and that's not what even the net is. Well, we don't know what it's trying to do, but that's not what the net is doing.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that analytics can't do that. So that would be the next step that hopefully we can get to at some point down the road here.
Do you like, and I'll let you go after this. I know you're trying to get me off.
No, I'm good forever.
Get me off the podcast. Do you like having efficiency within a system in which the NCAA is going to pick what teams get in the tournament and which ones don't, and the seeding and everything like that. Do you feel like that is a value that is clear cut in terms of needed for that?
Well, it's complicated because you have to think about it from how they're using the quadrant system. So I do like that the efficiency component is in net, because ultimately they're using it for the quadrant system, which is going to decide how good each team is, and then your record against top 50 teams versus top whatever the case may be.
Sure.
I don't like the quadrant system in general. So my push would be to get rid of the quadrant system.
I don't like it either.
But given that we have it, I actually like net as a way to. It's an organizational metric. So net can tell you if that team you played was a top 50 team a lot better than RPI can, which is a low standard because RPI was so bad.
Yeah, that's right.
If I was the NCAA and I wanted to give good publicity to what we're doing, the net, that would be my angle. That's that's what it's doing well.
So I wonder if they do cap the efficiency numbers, how much more accurate, because it's pretty accurate right now. I mean, I'm looking at it now as of today, and I mean, again, Virginia 1, Gonzaga 2, Duke 3, Michigan 4, Tennessee 5, Michigan State 6. I don't think anybody's going to argue with that. Like, you may argue with, a little bit here and there, but there's not a lot of disparity between even the eye test or looking at their resumes or whatnot. Kentucky's at 8, Houston's at 7. Most people would probably say, well, I'd have Kentucky over Houston. Fine. But again, it's kind of splitting hairs at that point. I mean, I think they got it pretty good in the top 6, 8 teams right now.
And here's another way of looking at it to evaluate your metric is how is the Vegas spread when those two teams play each other.
Yeah.
Is that, and I think that's one of the reasons why KenPom got accepted so quickly, is that it was basically the spread. And it still is very close to the spread. So to answer your question, if they got rid of the efficiency component or capped it, they capped it, it would look less like the Vegas spread. It would go away from the power ratings, but that might be better for the NCAA selection process, which it shouldn't. They're different goals, basically. But from a pure predictive Vegas spread perspective, the efficiency is good to have in there.
All right, last thing. If I'm looking at three metrics, net's got to be one of them right now because the NCAA tells me I have to look at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
KenPom, what else would you suggest that I'm looking at? What else do you like?
Okay, so I did a podcast with John Gasaway, and we are both advocates for this metric, and it's called wins above bubble. Okay, so it sounds a little bit complicated at first, but I actually coached Jans last year at New Mexico State. We ranked really good in wins above bubble last year, and so I was kind of nervous about explaining it to him. And he's a really smart numbers guy. He pretends like he's not, but he really is. It's almost his stick, I think. He picked it up right away. So let me see if I can do this for you. All right. Let's take the NC State example and why it would deal with NC State better. When they play UNC Asheville, who they played, they have a 98% chance of winning that game.
Okay.
What wins above bubble does is the average bubble team has a 98% chance to beat UNC Asheville. They beat them, so you get 2%. That's all you get.
Got it.
If it was a 50-50 game, you would get 50%. So if you notice, your point or how much you won the game by has nothing to do with it.
Sure. Okay.
It's just win or lose. If you lost that game to UNC Asheville, you would get minus 0.98. And so you add those up throughout the whole year, and you have how many more wins you got than the average bubble team would get. And there's no point differential. You can't run up the score. You just have to try to win the game, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Okay. All right. I'll check that out. That's different. I never even heard of that.
Yeah. The The thing that maybe you've heard of from your time at ESPN, which is very similar to wins above bubble, is strength of record. That was ESPN's version of it.
Yep. And you like wins above bubble better?
Yeah. Well, the thing with the ESPN stuff is not that it's bad at all, but there's not a ton of transparency for it. So it's hard to evaluate because it's an inside thing. Whereas wins above bubble was really a Twitter thing. Seth Byrne is the guy on Twitter who has popularized it, so it's a little bit more transparent.
Perfect. All right, well, I will let you go. I didn't mean to keep you on this long, trying to educate you here. It's not easy, trust me. You could ask anybody else in the industry who knows me. This is a difficult task, but if we can take baby steps, and I'm more than willing to pay you in dinners in Minneapolis or anything like that. And we can figure it out.
I will be at the Final Four for sure. And like I said, I'm envisioning Hoop Vision statistics from the pickup game. I really want to make that happen.
If we do that, I may have to pull up lame with another injury. I'm not sure I need those statistics put out there publicly. It'll look something like this. Ready? This is what it'll look like. 0 for 2 from the field. Both shots coming, within about 10 feet, 6 or 7 assists, no turnovers. Defense will not be very good anymore because, frankly, I was never much of an athlete, and now everybody's younger than me that will be playing in that game. So, yeah, it wouldn't. The stat line would not look as good. You couldn't really get the full gist of my impact from the numbers. How's that?
What we really need to do is have the seniors who are in that 3-on-3 tournament that will be all around Minneapolis. We need to have them come to the game and do write-ups on scouting evaluations of the media. That's what needs to happen.
Yes. Nobody needs to see those games. Trust me. No, I played in them once. I think I played in it once. Probably had to be going back about 10 years ago. It's before Norlander and Borzello and Dostler. So Pete Thamel played in it then. And I realized when Pete played in it, he never stopped running and moving. And other people were like that too. And I was just like, I'm not ready for this. I'm not in shape for this thing. I could play a game or two and then I'm done. Then I'm going back to my hotel room and I'm going to chill out.
Well, at the very least, we'll have you shoot 100 free throws for the podcast. So
all right, there you go.
There you go.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on. I really mean that, Jordan. Like I said earlier, sincerely mean like you do one hell of a job, and it was good coming on the pod, and I will say this, literally, I was probably more nervous coming on this pod than any pod or radio show I've done in a while because, again, it's just not my element, and but I appreciate you kind of bearing with me on that end, and I think the two worlds can collide pretty well, and I think that's the cool part of it now is me understanding that there's a lot to be learned. As long as somebody has the patience to try to teach me, which is not the easiest thing. There's a lot to be learned.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do it. I love the end, to flip it around a little bit. And yeah, I mean, I can't thank you enough for coming on, and then also for your support earlier in the year, sharing some of the stuff that I've been doing. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Jordan. Take care, and we'll talk soon.
No hand checking Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc.